Hello, resilient listeners. This is Jennifer Chambers. And for this week, I thought I'd share a couple of related items and share a story from one of my books that I wrote called Remarkable Oregon Women, Revolutionaries and Visionaries, because I think in this month, being International Women's History Month, we need to celebrate all the accomplishments of women that we can. But first, I have two things. The first is a short story called Sourdough Bread, from a book that I have from my collection called With Her Own Wings, Remarkable Stories of Women in History. It was originally published in 1948, so there's no restriction on me reading it. But this story is called Sourdough Bread by E. Gamby. Dr. Gamby is the son of E.B. Gamby, who came to Portland in 1881. Many references to sourdough bread can be found in accounts of wagon trains and pioneer life. And this book says, although it is seldom made by modern women, is it occasionally used by hunters and fishermen, who, like Dr. Gamby, served it to their camp companions. Of course, as we know now, the sourdough bread boom of 2020 and pandemic time has come and gone, but I have personally gotten a whole lot of enjoyment in baking this year. And so at the end of the story, I'll share my own personal recipe for sourdough bread. Very easy and very fun. And I think that it's a great kind of tip for being resilient and doing things that make you feel good. And making bread is one of those things that has proven true over this last year for so many of us. So why not? So here's the story, Sourdough Bread, by E. Gamby. The packs of pioneer hunters, scouts, and prospectors contained little which was not essential to their continued existence when they were beyond the frontier trading post. The cooking equipment rarely consisted of more than a cup, a frying pan, and perhaps 2 small buckets. Flour, beans, soda, and salt were carried to augment the diet of fish and game. The method by which flour, water, salt, soda, instinct, and imagination were combined to produce the delicious bread will be told as I learned it from my father and other frontier people. Everyone knows that a mixture of flour and water, if left in a fairly warm place, will collect wild yeast from the air, ferment, and ultimately become sour. Bread made by using the sour mixture as a base has long been known as sourdough bread. Sourdough can be started, as suggested above, but it is better to obtain a start from a sourdough artist, and in this way obtain better yeast in addition to saving considerable time. Now, I would put it out there that I would guess that listeners, you probably know someone who has their own sourdough starter. There are a lot of people around that have still kept it up. So you could get one from a friend if you asked around. Now, this story says, it continues, a young lady from Alaska recently told me of her mother's sourdough bread that was started 40 years ago. And given that this was written in 1948, in 1908, that's quite an old starter, and I hope it's still alive. To make bread, part of that thick sourdough is poured into a depression in the flour contained in the sack. Salt and soda are added, and the mixture is stirred until just thick enough to lift a gob of dough into the greased frying pan. There is no objection to dividing it into individual biscuits at this time if preferred. The scraps of dough that remain, with additional flour and water, are now added to the sourdough remaining in the jar. The mixture is stirred and permitted to develop the foundation for the next batch of bread. The bread is baked by placing the frying pan over the fire until the undersurface of the loaf is brown and the whole mass of dough is firm. Some artists now toss the bread into the air, catch it bottom side up in the frying pan, and return it to the fire until done. Others set the pan near the fire, support the handle with a stick, and tip it while the radiant heat finishes baking and browning the top. When the part nearest the fire is brown, the frying pan is given a quick jerk to the side, thus rotating it under the bread in order to bring a different area of the top near the source of heat. The bread is slightly sour and has a delightful aroma all of its own. And the quotation here says, "Stop the talk and eat this bread while it's hot." I think it's just a very fun article because it shows how it's not really all that different now than it was then. My recipe for sourdough, I have taken a long time ago from an old article in Mother Earth News magazine. And I can tell you that I've used it for both gluten-free and gluten-full bread, you can use an all-purpose gluten-free flour that has xanthan gum already contained in it. One of the brands that I like the best is called Cup for Cup. I also like, I've used the Bob's Red Mill variety. It's not my favorite, but I've used it several times. You'll have to experiment with gluten-free flours and find the kind you like. I have, on my website, I have my personal blend that I use, and any blend that you like will work for this. It's just fine. So, to make my sourdough recipe, and it's actually more of a refrigerator sourdough, which makes it a whole lot easier. You start with 3 cups of warm water. Now, warm is a relative term. I feel like warm is about body temperature, about 98, 99, 100 degrees if you're going to measure it. Basically, I like to put it in the measuring cup, and if you put your pinky in it, it's neither cold nor hot. That gives you about the right temperature. It's just a feel thing. So you take 3 cups of warm water and put it in a mixing bowl. Then you add 1.5 tablespoons of yeast and salt. Then stir. The yeast will be slightly bubbly. Then sprinkle 1.5 to 2 tablespoons of sugar on the top and stir again. You can allow this to what they call proof and wait until the yeast gets and the mixture gets a lot more bubbly if you wish, but you don't have to. One of the beauty things about this recipe is that it's just absolutely ridiculously easy. You don't have to wait. You can simply add the flour. And at this point, after all of the water, the yeast, the salt, and the sugar have been incorporated together, add 6.5 cups of whatever flour you choose. Sometimes I've used 5 cups of flour and 1.5 cups of oatmeal or ground almonds, or you name it. You can do any sort of combination you would like. Then you mix it all together until it becomes a shaggy dough. Shaggy means that's one of those things that they often say in recipes that they don't really give an explanation for, but the term means that things are mostly cleaning the edges of the bowl, not all, but mostly. So they kind of break apart a little bit. It's mostly coming together. So once your dough is shaggy, you can use your hands to make it into a round shape. You can make 1 or 2. This will make 2 round loaves. And the way that I like to do it is I spread cornmeal onto a baking sheet, and I put a round loaf in the middle of the baking sheet. Round, slightly oval. Let it rise for about 20 minutes or half an hour. Slash the top, and then bake at 450 for 30 minutes. One of the great things about this recipe is that you can use it for bread, yes, but you can also use it for pizza dough. You can use it for focaccia. You can even roll it out and make cinnamon rolls with it if you prefer. It's delicious and super versatile, and it's one of those things that gets better the longer you have it in the fridge. So I like to keep some in the fridge fairly often so that you can have it anytime. If you feel like pizza on a Saturday, then you've got it. You can keep almost indefinitely if you keep it airtight. You do bake it at the same amount, about a half an hour at 450, depending upon what you're baking. If it's smaller, use a little less time. Of course, use your best judgment. Now, the story I was reading about the pioneer people who baked a similar type of bread, they would do it with water. They would do it with milk. They would use sour milk or buttermilk. They could put bacon on the top to help it brown. They use cornmeal sometimes as part of their substitutions. It's a very, very versatile and useful recipe, but it's kind of fun to see that it hasn't really changed a lot in, over 100 years. It's one of those recipes that's just kept on going. Now, the recipe that I shared was my version of the recipe, again, in Mother Earth News magazine. And I'll put the recipe in the show notes so you'll have it. But again, it's 3 cups of water, 1.5 teaspoons was incorrect. When I said it the first time, it's 1.5 tablespoons of yeast, 1.5 tablespoons of salt, and 1.5 tablespoons of sugar. Mix those together, and then add 6.5 cups of the flour of your choice and bake at 450 for 30 minutes. So the story from my book, Revolutionaries and Visionaries, I wanted to share is about one of the favorite subjects of the people I wrote about in this book. I was able to write about 50 or 60 different amazing women in my book. And my very favorite was Hazel Ying Lee. Hazel Ying Lee was born in Portland, Oregon. And Portland, in the early 1900s, was not a hospitable place for Chinese American women. Hazel Ying Lee's parents, Yuet Lee and Sue Lan Lee, had met as immigrants in the United States while in Portland. She was one of 8 children born to the hard-working merchant couple. Hazel Ying's brother, Victor Lee, would become a serviceman with the U.S. Tank Corps. As a student, Hazel likely attended the Chinese language and culture classes after school each day that most Chinese children in Portland did at that time. She learned a few things that women did not do in that era as she was growing up. Hazel learned how to play cards. Hazel drove a car, and Hazel swam. Those were all pretty unusual for women of her day. After graduation from Commerce High School, she was employed as an elevator operator, which was one of the jobs that was open to Chinese American women, at the Lieb's department store in Portland. Elsie Chang, Hazel's friend, said, "In those days, jobs available to Chinese girls were only elevator operator or stockroom girl. Doing office work was just a daydream." Hazel was a good student, and she became fascinated with flying after her first flight. She joined a flying class in 1932, courtesy of the Chinese Benevolent Society, to learn how to fly herself for the Chinese Flying Club. Her instructor was a noted aviator, and she was able to, in October of 1932, become the first Chinese American woman to get her flying license. Frances Lee Tong, Hazel's sister, said that Hazel told their mother that she was going to learn how to fly. "My mother said she was so ahead of her time." Hazel traveled to China to live with relatives in 1932, 2 siblings, when times were hard for the family during the Great Depression. Upon the Japanese invasion of China, she attempted to become part of the Chinese Air Force along with 14 other Chinese Americans who were living in Canton. The Chinese Air Force would not accept a female fighter pilot, despite her enormous experience. One of the other people in her group, a man called Clifford Louise Yim Quinn, was accepted. He would go on to become Hazel's husband. He had an illustrious career himself and eventually became a general in the Chinese Air Force. He would go on himself to be the chief executive officer of China Airlines. Hazel, undeterred by her refusal by the Chinese Air Force, worked for a group for the purpose of pro-Chinese propaganda. She also flew for a private airline in southern China to increase her flying expertise and helped found a flying school there. When the Japanese invaded China in 1937, Hazel stayed where she was. According to other people in the area, her calm demeanor was a help to other Americans in the region throughout the bombing and the warfare. She tried to join the Chinese Air Force again, nothing if not persistent, Miss Hazel, but she was again rejected. After her escape to Hong Kong, she returned to the United States. Now, I was able to read several different ideas for how she might have escaped, and the version that I like the best is the one that has her escaping in the bottom of a boat. She hid in the bottom and was a stowaway to get back to the United States. And it was quite an accomplishment at the time. And then as events progressed during World War II, the environment for Japanese Americans deteriorated even further in the United States. President Roosevelt signed the Executive Order 9066, which authorized the evacuation of all persons deemed a threat to national security from the West Coast to relocation centers further inland. Thousands of people were relocated to internment camps in the Northwest and elsewhere. And it was just a shameful part of our history, and we are just now finding out more and more about these camps, especially here in Oregon, where many of them were. Now, at that time, in 1937, Hazel was 30, and she applied again for service in the Women Air Force Service Pilots, which is now referred to as the WASPs in the United States. She entered flight school at the Avenger Field in Sweetwater, Texas in February of 1943, and she did extremely well according to reports. She loved to fly, and she graduated on August 1943. Her yearbook photo shows a confident woman with a neat appearance, much like the other WASPs of the era. The yearbook itself from Sweetwater has a logo that was designed by Walt Disney, of all people. It shows a female flyer named Fifinella with wings and a flight helmet poised as if jumping through the sky. She looks a little bit like Minnie Mouse. If you look closely, it's not dissimilar to Minnie Mouse, and reports say that Walt Disney did use her as models for his later cartoon characters. Now, this character, Fifinella, was also created for a film and a book by Roald Dahl, interestingly enough. And Disney allowed the service to use the form in World War II. Eleanor Roosevelt commented in 1942, "This is not a time when women should be patient. We are in a war and we need to fight it with all our ability and every weapon possible. Women pilots, in this particular case, are a waiting weapon to be used." Hazel certainly was ambitious and eager to fight. She was based at the Romulus Air Base in Michigan. Soon, Hazel was ferrying fighter airplanes from airports to shipping locations all over the country. She was actually, one of the fun things I found out about her, she was an excellent cook as well, and she was sought after as a fellow on overnight stays because she was a good cook, and if she didn't know the best places to eat in the area, and she often did, she could always cook. She cooked a lot of traditional foods and a lot of big foods, so she was able to feed all of the women within her unit. So she was very popular, and she also was rumored to have a wonderful sense of humor. She and the other WASPs were responsible for ferrying more than 5,000 aircraft to be transported to Alaska and the Soviet Union or other points for combat with the male pilots. They weren't allowed to fly the planes in combat, but they were allowed to ferry them to the location so they could be taken for the men to use. Once she was towing an aircraft across the United States when she had to make an emergency landing in the middle of a field in Kansas. The farmer mistook her for a Japanese pilot and an enemy, not being aware of the females who were in service at the time. He chased her around the airplane and the entire field with a pitchfork until she was able to identify herself and calm them both down. Hazel was ferrying a P-63 Super Cobra from the Bell manufacturer in Niagara Falls, New York to Great Falls, Montana on November 10th, 1944, in the midst of a crowded airport only just cleared of an incredible snowstorm. There was much confusion among the airport within the aircrafts attempting to land. Hazel and another aircraft crashed into each other, and the planes went down. Hazel was pulled from the flaming wreckage by her jacket, which was on fire. She did not recover from the burns and injuries caused by the collision, and she died 2 days later on November 12, 1944. Her death would be the 38th and last of the WASPs to be killed while on active duty. The incredible thing about Hazel's story is that these female pilots, these WASPs, were considered civilians, not soldiers, and they weren't entitled to military benefits or burial. One of the WASP veterans commented, "We were raw civilians, though. We didn't get the pay, we didn't get life insurance, we didn't get anything. We worked for a lesser salary than the second lieutenants, which was the lowest grade of the pilots." So to add to her parents' loss, unfortunately, Hazel's brother Victor was killed in action 3 days after her death. When her family requested that their children be buried together in a plot in Riverside Cemetery in Portland, they were denied on the basis of their race. Their sister Florence wrote to President Roosevelt in indignation, and then finally the cemetery reversed its policy, upset about the potential for bad publicity, and the pair is buried side by side in Riverview Cemetery. As the two countries were allies, the anti-Chinese exclusion acts were starting to be repealed as of 1943, and when the first Chinese-American man was naturalized in California at that time. The laws got better, but the WASPs were not publicly recognized when they were disbanded in 1944 or thereafter for some time. The remaining WASPs and their families tried to fight for military status, and eventually President Carter signed a bill in 1977 to give them military benefits, with honorary discharges awarded the following year. Hazel was inducted into the Oregon Aviation Hall of Honor at the Evergreen Air Museum in Oregon in 2004. And finally, on March 10th, 2010, she and the other WASPs received the Congressional Medal of Honor at the Gold Medal ceremony on Capitol Hill. Her name is in a star in the Walk of the Heroines on the Portland State University campus. I hope you enjoyed these little interjections, these little interludes of stories from history. I really loved being able to share the sourdough vignette and the recipe. As always, if you have any questions or comments, please email me at resilientpodcastmail@gmail.com or follow me on Instagram at Resilient Podcast Network. And we have daily writing prompts on that Instagram. There's a lot of fun stuff going on the Instagram account, so check it out. We also have an upcoming class on memoirs without misery that I'll be publicizing pretty soon, but you guys get the first book. And lastly, thank you very much for listening. My daughter wants to say hello before I go.
Hi.
Thanks. Have a good week.
I wanted to break in for a quick minute to talk to you a little bit about Buzzsprout. Now, Buzzsprout is the service that I use to produce this podcast. Let's get your podcast launched. Start it for free. Today is a great day to start your own podcast. Whether you're looking for a new marketing channel, if you have a message you want to share with the world, or just think it would be fun to have your own talk show, podcasting is an easy, inexpensive, and fun way to expand your reach online. Buzzsprout is hands down the easiest and best way to launch, promote, and track your podcast. Your show can be online and listed in all the major podcast directories like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and more within minutes of finishing your recording. Podcasting, it seems hard, but it isn't hard when you have the right partners, and the team at Buzzsprout is passionate about helping you succeed. Join over 100,000 podcasters who are already using Buzzsprout to get their message out to the world. Let's create something great together. Now, listeners, you can get a $20 Amazon gift card after your second month if you sign up for a paid plan, and it does help support our show. We use Buzzsprout. It's so easy. You can start with some gear you already have in a quiet space. And then again, if you want to upgrade, Buzzsprout has tons of guides to help you find the right equipment at the right price. You'll get a great looking podcast website, audio players that you can drop into other websites, detailed analytics to see how people are listening, tools to promote your episodes, and more. Join over 100,000 podcasters already using their Buzzsprout to get their message out into the world. Use the link in the show notes to start your show today.